The endless quiet of the evening was silent, wrapped in the kind of calm that feels like the world is holding its breath. A soft wind drifted through the empty streets, brushing against the leaves that clung to the last traces of summer. Somewhere, far away, a distant train rumbled, its echo rolling gently through the air like a memory of movement. Everything else was stilled in a small, quiet town where the days often seemed to stretch on forever. There lived a man named Samuel. He was not remarkable in any particular way, neither wealthy nor poor, neither lonely nor entirely content. He simply existed, in the way most people do, moving through life like a leaf carried by a slow-moving river. Each night, he would sit by the single window in his living room, watching as the colors of the day faded into shades of soft gray. The old clock on his wall ticked softly, its steady rhythm like a heartbeat in an otherwise still house. He liked that sound. It wasn't loud or demanding. It simply existed, a reminder that time was moving, even when everything else seemed at rest. Sometimes he would close his eyes and listen, counting the seconds not because he needed to, but because it gave his mind something small and simple to hold on to. The night outside deepened. A few stars appeared, scattered like distant lanterns in the sky. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his mind wandering to nothing in particular. He thought about the way the wind sounded when it passed through the cracks of his window. He thought about the smell of the wood in his old floorboards, warmed by years of sunlight. He thought about the day that had just ended, not because it had been extraordinary, but because he found a kind of quiet beauty in its simplicity. There had been no excitement, no drama. He had walked to the market that morning, greeting the same shopkeeper who always smiled politely but never seemed to say much. He had purchased bread, some tea, and a jar of honey. On the way home, he had paused on a wooden bridge just outside town, listening to the slow trickle of water beneath it. There was nothing particularly special about that moment, but it stayed with him the way quiet things often do. The chair beneath him creaked slightly as he shifted. The night was cool, and he pulled a worn blanket over his lap. The fabric smelled faintly of soap and sunlight from the afternoon when he had hung it on the line to dry. These small things, clean laundry, warm light, the sound of a clock, were the things that made up his life. They were small, but they were steady. In the kitchen, the kettle sat unused. He considered making tea, but the thought felt like too much effort at that moment. Instead, he let his thoughts drift. He thought about the books on his shelf, each one carrying a story he had read long ago but could barely recall. He liked to imagine that the stories still lived inside those books, waiting for him, like sleeping things that would wake again when opened at a car passed by outside, its headlights casting a soft glow through his curtains for a brief moment. Then it was gone, and the night returned to its usual stillness. Samuel smiled faintly. He liked the way the world seemed to slow down at night, as though it, too, needed to rest. Time moved gently. He shifted again, stretching his legs and feeling the weight of the day sink into his body. His eyelids were heavy, but he wasn't ready to sleep just yet. Instead, he let his thoughts wander further back to his childhood, when nights like this felt endless and filled with wonder. He remembered lying in bed, listening to the crickets outside his window, thinking about how big the world must be. He remembered the smell of his grandmother's kitchen, freshly baked bread, warm and comforting. He remembered the sound of rain on the roof, how it had always made him feel safe, like the world was tucking him in. These were memories that came like whispers, quiet and soft, never asking for much attention, but always there. The clock ticked on. The house made its own small noises. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft groan of the wood as it shifted with the night air. Samuel listened, not really thinking, just being. Sometimes he felt that these moments were the closest thing to peace he had ever known. The world outside was still. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, their leaves whispering as though sharing secrets with one another. The moon had risen higher, casting pale silver light over the rooftops and streets. Somewhere, a dog barked, but the sound was distant, almost muted. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the blanket against his legs, the cool air against his face. His breathing slowed. The chair was warm from his own body heat, and the cushion beneath him felt soft and familiar. The night stretched on, slow and unhurried. The night had settled like a soft blanket over the small town, quiet and unassuming. The streets were empty, lit only by the pale glow of street lamps that stood like sentinels along the sidewalks. Their light pooled onto the pavement in uneven circles, casting long shadows that swayed with the gentle night breeze. Everything seemed to have slowed, as though time itself was taking a deep breath. Inside a modest house at the corner of the street, Samuel sat by his window. The house was old, built with thick wooden beams that had witnessed countless seasons. Its walls bore the faint smell of cedar and aged paint, and the floorboards creaked with every small movement. Samuel had lived here for many years. It was not a grand home, but it was a place filled with quiet memories. Memories that came alive during nights like these. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the worn fabric against his shoulders. The chair was an old piece, perhaps older than Samuel himself, but he had never considered replacing it. It was comfortable, not just because of the softness of the cushions, but because it carried the weight of familiarity. Each creak and sigh of the chair reminded him of all the nights he had spent here, watching the world outside his window. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, its pendulum swinging back and forth like a slow heartbeat. Samuel found comfort in its sound. Each tick seemed to erase a little bit of the day's weight, carrying it away into the quiet of the night. That a faint scent of the outside air drifted through the window. It smelled of the earth, damp and cool, mixed with the scent of distant flowers that only bloomed at night. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment and inhaled deeply. The night had its own language, he thought, a language of whispers and stillness. Earlier in the day, the town had been filled with its usual hum of activity. People had walked the streets, children had played near the park, and cars had passed by with their engines growling softly. But now all of that was gone. The quiet had replaced the noise, like the tide covering the sand. Samuel stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees. He walked to the small kitchen, his footsteps making faint sounds on the wooden floor. The kitchen was simple, a small wooden table, 2 chairs, and a counter lined with neatly arranged jars and utensils. He reached for the kettle, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. The sound of the water pouring was soft, almost soothing as the kettle began to heat. Samuel sat back down, letting his mind drift. He thought of the bridge he had walked across earlier that day. The water beneath it had been calm, reflecting the pale blue of the sky. He remembered pausing there, resting his hands on the railing and watching the sunlight dance on the water's surface. There had been no rush, no reason to move quickly. A faint whistle from the kettle pulled him back to the present. He rose again, slowly, and turned off the stove. He poured the hot water into a cup, adding a spoonful of tea leaves that swirled gently in the steam. He held the cup for a moment, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. Samuel returned to his chair with the tea, taking small sips. The warmth of the drink seemed to slow his thoughts even further. He stared at the faint light coming from the lamp outside his window, watching the way it illuminated the branches of a nearby tree. The leaves shifted slightly in the breeze, their movements slow and rhythmic, like the breathing of the night itself. The quiet was not empty. It was filled with soft details, sounds and textures that often went unnoticed during the rush of the day. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint creak of the wood in the walls, the soft rustle of leaves outside. Samuel listened, letting each sound pass through him like a wave. He took another sip of tea, letting its warmth linger in his mouth. He thought of his grandmother's house, long gone now, but still alive in his memory. She had always made tea at night, the scent filling the kitchen as she hummed a tune that Samuel could no longer remember the words to. The memory made him smile faintly, though there was a hint of sadness too. The clock ticked on. The teacup was warm in Samuel's hands, the steam rising in slow, graceful wisps that disappeared into the cool air of the room. He didn't drink it all at once. He simply held it for a while, letting the heat sink into his fingers, feeling the weight of the cup, the way the ceramic surface was slightly rough beneath his fingertips. The room was softly lit by a single lamp in the corner. Its yellow glow was warm and steady, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Samuel had always preferred this kind of light, the kind that felt like it belonged to the night, quiet and soft, never harsh or intrusive. He could sit here for hours, doing nothing but listening to the stillness around him. The night outside was deepening. The sky was dark now, with only a few faint clouds drifting across the stars. The town, too, had grown quiet. The occasional sound of a car was distant, almost like an echo from far away. Samuel found a strange comfort in this stillness. As though the world itself was slowly settling into sleep, he leaned back in his chair, staring out of the window, watching the faint silhouette of the tree in front of his house. Its branches swayed ever so slightly in the breeze, and every now and then, a single leaf would break free, floating gently to the ground. There was something poetic about it. How a leaf could fall so quietly, without anyone noticing, and yet still be a part of the story of the night. Samuel's eyes grew heavier. He wasn't tired in the way one feels after a long day's work. It was a softer, gentler tiredness, like a whisper urging him to rest. He took another small sip of tea, letting the taste linger before placing the cup back on the table beside him. The sound of the cup touching the wood was faint, almost absorbed by the silence of the room. His thoughts began to drift again. He thought about a field he used to visit as a boy, just outside town. It had been wide and open, filled with tall grass that swayed like waves when the wind blew. He remembered lying on his back, staring at the sky for what felt like hours, watching the clouds move slowly overhead. He remembered how the earth felt under his hands, cool and steady, grounding him even as his thoughts wandered far away. Samuel smiled faintly at the memory. Those were the kinds of moments that stayed with you, the quiet ones, the ones that didn't demand anything but your attention. He had always loved the sound of the wind in that field. It wasn't a loud or forceful sound, but a soft, almost secretive one, like nature was speaking in its own language. The faint creak from the house brought him back. It wasn't unusual. Old houses had a way of talking at night. They shifted, they settled, they released the day's warmth. Samuel liked to imagine that the house was alive in its own way, keeping him company during these quiet hours. The tea was nearly gone now. He placed the cup in the kitchen sink, but didn't bother washing it just yet. That could wait until morning. He returned to the living room, settling once more into the chair. The blanket was still draped over his lap, warm and comforting. The clock continued its steady ticking. He began to listen more carefully, not just to the clock, but to the other sounds that surrounded him. The wind outside, whispering through the trees. The distant hum of a power line. The faint chirp of a cricket somewhere far off. Each sound felt like a note in a song that only the night could play. He thought again of his grandmother's voice, how soft it had been when she read to him as a child. She had a way of making even the most ordinary words sound like stories. Samuel remembered how he would fight sleep, wanting to hear every word, but the rhythm of her voice would always carry him away. He could almost hear her now, as though the memory itself was singing to him. Time was moving slowly. Samuel could feel it in the way his breathing had slowed, in the way his thoughts seemed to drift like leaves on water. He looked out the window again, noticing how the moonlight had shifted slightly, casting new patterns of shadow on the ground. It was as though the night was painting its own quiet picture, one that changed moment by moment if you were still enough to see it. He reached for the small notebook that rested on the table beside him. It was filled with empty pages, though he had always told himself that one day he would write something down. Not a story, necessarily, just thoughts, small observations about life. But tonight, he didn't feel the need to write. It was enough simply to think, to let his mind wander freely. The notebook lay untouched on the table, its blank pages quietly waiting. Samuel ran his fingers across the cover, feeling the faint texture of the worn leather. He liked the way it felt beneath his fingertips, soft in some places, rough in others, like a map of time etched into its surface. For a moment, he considered opening it, writing down something, anything. But instead, he simply closed his eyes and let the silence of the room fill him. The wind outside grew slightly stronger, though not harsh, just enough to make the branches of the tree tap gently against the window pane. The sound was soft, rhythmic, like a delicate knock that had no urgency. Samuel listened. There was something comforting in knowing that even the smallest sounds were alive in the night. His breathing matched the slow pace of the world around him. Each inhale felt cool, carrying with it the faint scent of wood and earth. Each exhale was warm and steady, blending into the air as though it belonged there. He had always loved nights like this, nights where nothing seemed to need his attention, where the world asked for nothing but stillness. Samuel's mind wandered to the street outside his house. He imagined the quiet rows of homes, each one holding its own version of this silence. Perhaps someone else was sitting by their window right now, sipping tea, lost in their thoughts just as he was. Perhaps someone was reading, their lamp casting the same kind of soft glow that filled Samuel's room. There was something peaceful about that thought. This shared, unspoken quiet among neighbors who never needed to say a word. He took a slow breath and shifted slightly in his chair. The blanket across his lap felt heavier now, not in a burdensome way, but in the way a familiar presence feels heavy yet safe. It reminded him of evenings long ago when he would sit wrapped in a quilt by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and crackle. He could almost hear that sound now, the dry wood popping softly, the warm scent of smoke lingering in the air. The clock on the wall ticked on, its pendulum swinging back and forth, back and forth. Samuel's gaze followed its motion for a while, his mind emptying of all but that steady rhythm. Time was moving, but it wasn't rushing. It never rushed in moments like this. It simply flowed, like a quiet stream winding its way through the night. He thought again of the bridge he had visited earlier that day. He could still picture the water beneath it, how it reflected the light in soft, broken patterns. He remembered leaning on the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath his hands, listening to the distant sound of birds. That memory lingered with him, as though a small part of that calm had followed him home. The wind shifted again, this time carrying with it the faintest sound of distant chimes. Somewhere, Perhaps a few houses down, a wind chime was swaying gently, its notes soft and random, like little whispers of music. Samuel smiled faintly. He had always liked wind chimes. Their sound reminded him that even the quietest things in life could be beautiful. He stood for a moment, stretching his legs, and walked slowly toward the window. The glass was cool beneath his fingertips as he rested his hand against it, looking out. The street was empty. A thin layer of mist had started to form near the ground, wrapping itself around the edges of the road like a soft, pale ribbon. The moonlight reflected off it, creating a glow that made the world outside look almost dreamlike. Samuel stayed there for a while, just watching. A single moth fluttered near the lamp outside, its small wings catching the light as it moved in slow, erratic circles. He followed its movements, thinking about how delicate it looked, how fragile, and yet how determined it seemed to keep flying. After a while, he returned to his chair, settling into its familiar shape once more. The blanket welcomed him like an old friend, and he pulled it closer around his shoulders. His teacup was empty now, but the warmth of it still lingered faintly in his hands. He closed his eyes again, listening. The world outside had grown even quieter. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but full of soft sounds, soft thoughts, soft moments that would pass like slow waves. Samuel leaned deeper into the chair, letting its familiar shape cradle him. His breathing slowed, and for a few moments, he simply sat with his eyes half closed, listening to the faint hum of life around him. The sound of the old clock was steady and reassuring, as if marking time not just for him, but for the entire house. Each tick blended into the quiet, becoming part of the rhythm of the night. He turned his gaze toward the bookshelf in the corner of the room. It was filled with books of all kinds, novels, journals, old notebooks with faded covers. Many of them hadn't been opened in years, yet Samuel kept them there like old friends. He imagined each one holding a story that had once mattered to him, words that had spoken to him on evenings just like this one. He wondered if perhaps, tomorrow, he would choose one at random and read a few pages. Not to finish the book, not for any purpose other than to drift with the words. The gentle sigh left his lips as he pulled the blanket tighter around himself. The air had grown cooler, but not unpleasantly so. It was the kind of coolness that carried a hint of freshness, the kind that belonged to the quiet moments between seasons. He let his thoughts wander with the cool air, floating like slow-moving clouds. The street lamp outside flickered once, its glow softening, then returning. Samuel noticed, but didn't give it much thought. Things like that seemed almost natural at this hour. He let his eyes rest on the faint mist rolling across the street, watching how it shifted and curled like a living thing. Every so often, a breeze would scatter it, and then it would gather again. Quiet and patient, he reached for the armrest of his chair, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. His hands had grown older, marked with faint lines and stories of their own. He studied them for a moment, wondering where all the years had gone. Life, he thought, was not made of big moments as much as it was made of these small, quiet hours, the ones nobody else saw, the ones that passed like whispered thoughts that a faint sound caught his attention. It wasn't loud, just the creak of a neighbor's door opening somewhere down the street. Samuel tilted his head slightly, listening. The sound was followed by footsteps, soft, unhurried footsteps moving across the pavement. He didn't look to see who it was. The night was full of such quiet comings and goings. Instead, he just let the sound pass, like a line of music in the background. His mind drifted to the garden behind the house. Though he couldn't see it now, he imagined the flowers resting under the moonlight, their petals folded in the cool air. He could almost smell the faint sweetness of the roses and hear the soft rustle of leaves. The garden was his quiet companion during the day, but at night, it seemed to belong to another world, a world where even the flowers seemed to dream. Samuel closed his eyes and leaned his head back. He thought of a time, many years ago, when he had spent an entire evening watching the stars. He had been younger then, sitting on a wooden bench, tracing constellations with his eyes. The stars had seemed endless, like tiny lights scattered by an unseen hand. He remembered how he had felt both small and infinite at the same time that he opened his eyes again, and for a moment, he considered stepping outside. But he didn't move. The warmth of the chair and blanket was too comforting. Instead, he let the memory of that starry night linger, like a picture in his mind. The clock ticked on, the house settled around him, its walls holding the quiet like a secret. He listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak from the roof as it cooled in the night air. These sounds, though small, filled the space with life. Samuel thought of the bridge again. He thought of how the water had moved so slowly that morning, barely disturbed by the breeze. He had stood there, leaning on the railing, watching the way the light danced across the surface. He wondered how many mornings he had stood there, watching, without ever realizing how much those moments mattered. The night had grown even deeper now, stretching endlessly like a soft, dark curtain drawn across the world. Samuel noticed how the street outside seemed almost frozen in time. The mist clung low to the ground, moving only when the wind nudged it gently, like a hand brushing across fabric. It gave the scene a dreamlike quality, as though he were looking at a memory rather than something real. He shifted slightly in his chair, feeling the cushion mold to his shape. The blanket had grown warm against his legs, carrying the faint scent of fresh linen. These small comforts were enough to hold him there, motionless, content just to be a witness to the night's quiet unfolding. That a thought crossed his mind about how rare it was to have moments like this, moments without noise or distraction. He had lived much of his life surrounded by sound, conversations, machines, the hum of daily tasks. But here, now, the world was pared down to its simplest form, just the steady beat of time and the whisper of the wind. He let that simplicity wash over him. His eyes drifted once more to the bookshelf in the corner. A single book caught his attention, not because of its title, but because of the way the light from the lamp fell on its spine. It was an old journal, one he had filled years ago with half-finished thoughts and observations about the world. He thought about getting up to open it, to read the words his younger self had written, but he didn't move. There was no urgency. Everything could wait tonight. That a faint sound of leaves scraping along the street reached him. Somewhere, a breeze was pushing a cluster of fallen leaves into motion, their edges catching against the pavement. Samuel listened to the soft, irregular pattern of their movement. It reminded him of being a boy, raking leaves with his father in the late autumn afternoons. He could almost smell the crisp scent of burning leaves, hear the distant laughter of children playing down the street. Those memories always felt warm, like a photograph faded with time but never forgotten. The moon had shifted higher in the sky, its silver glow stretching across the rooftops. Samuel watched as the shadows outside rearranged themselves. Each change so subtle, it was almost unnoticeable unless you were still, truly still. He found a kind of magic in that. The slow, quiet transformations of the night that only revealed themselves to those willing to sit and see. The clock ticked on. That Samuel's thoughts wandered to tomorrow. There was nothing special planned, just another slow day, perhaps a walk to the bridge again, perhaps a visit to the market for bread and tea. But the thought of tomorrow didn't weigh on him. It was soft, like a distant cloud drifting on the horizon. Tonight was enough that a car passed by, its headlights gliding across his window like a pale brushstroke of light. He didn't bother to look at it. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by the night's stillness. For a while, Samuel just listened to his own breathing, noticing how it rose and fell like the tide. It was strange, he thought, how comforting something as simple as your own breath could be when the world around you was silent. He reached down to adjust the blanket, tucking it under his feet. A faint crackle of fabric filled the room as he shifted, but then all was quiet again. He thought about the night sky beyond the mist. Though he couldn't see the stars clearly, he imagined them there, distant, unchanging, keeping their silent watch as they had for countless nights before. The memory of his grandmother came back once more. She had been the kind of person who moved slowly through life, never in a hurry. He remembered sitting at her kitchen table as she sipped tea in silence, sometimes looking out the window, as though watching a world only she could see. Samuel realized that, in many ways, he had grown to resemble her. Perhaps this stillness had always been part of him, inherited in some way. The house groaned softly as it adjusted to the cool night air. The sound was almost like a sigh, and Samuel found himself smiling at the thought of the house breathing alongside him. He let his eyes close for a moment, just to rest them, though he didn't intend to fall asleep yet. He listened, letting the quiet sounds blend together. The clock, the wind, the faint hum of life. Samuel's eyelids felt heavy now, but he resisted sleep, wanting to savor the stillness for just a while longer. The night had become his companion, wrapping him in its soft embrace. Outside, the mist had thickened slightly, turning the world into something distant and quiet, as if everything beyond the window existed only in whispers. The clock ticked softly, counting each passing second with gentle precision. Its sound had become a kind of lullaby, steady, patient, endlessly repeating. Samuel's breathing matched its rhythm, slow and unhurried. He felt no need to move, no need to speak or think. There was only this moment, and that was enough. His thoughts drifted once more, this time to the distant sound of rain. Not the real rain outside, for the night was clear, but the memory of rain. He remembered lying in bed as a boy, listening to raindrops hit the roof, a soft percussion that lulled him into dreams. Even now, decades later, the thought of rain brought him peace. He imagined it now, tapping gently against the window, blending with the hum of the world. For a moment, he could almost hear it. He shifted slightly, pulling the blanket closer. Its warmth felt like an embrace, a reminder of comfort and safety. Samuel let his gaze fall to the floor, tracing the patterns in the wood grain. They were like tiny rivers, twisting and turning, carrying stories older than the house itself. He found himself wondering about the lives that had touched these floors over the years, the footsteps, the laughter, the quiet moments like this one. The lamp in the corner glowed softly, its light reaching just far enough to warm the shadows without chasing them away. Samuel liked that. Shadows, he thought, gave depth to a room. They made the light feel alive, like a gentle balance between day and night. That he reached for the empty teacup, turning it slowly in his hands, feeling the cool ceramic against his skin. It was simple, unremarkable, yet it carried with it the small ritual of comfort. Tea in the evening, a companion to the silence. Perhaps tomorrow he would brew a new pot and sit here again, listening to the world. Outside, a breeze rustled through the trees. It wasn't strong, just enough to make the branches sway like dancers moving slowly to an invisible song. Samuel imagined the sound of the leaves brushing against one another, like soft whispers shared between old friends. His mind wandered back to the bridge. He could see it clearly now in his memory, the wooden planks worn smooth by time, the water below moving like liquid glass. He thought about how many mornings he had stood there, alone but never lonely. The bridge, like this chair, had become a quiet witness to his life. The clock ticked on. Minutes passed like water flowing downstream. Samuel barely noticed them. His body had relaxed completely, sinking into the warmth of the blanket. His thoughts, too, had slowed, becoming less like sentences and more like fragments of feelings, soft warmth, faint light, the whisper of wind. The world outside the window seemed frozen in a kind of peace. The mist glowed under the moonlight, silver and pale. A single leaf floated down from the tree, turning gently in the air before landing on the ground. Samuel watched it for a moment, thinking how quietly things came and went in life, like leaves, like days, like nights such as this. His eyes closed again, and this time he didn't open them. He wasn't asleep, not yet, but he was close, hovering in that space where thoughts become dreams. The chair creaked softly beneath him, a familiar sound, almost like a good-night whisper he thought one last time of the stars, even though he couldn't see them through the mist. They were there, he knew, silent, patient, shining for no one in particular. Just as the night would always be there, waiting for anyone willing to sit still and listen. Samuel's breathing slowed even further. The night stretched on, endless and kind, holding him in its quiet arms. Story 2 starts here. The house where silence lives. The night began without hurry, as though the world itself had decided to slow down. The sky outside the window was a muted gray-blue, the last traces of sunlight bleeding away into soft, indistinct shadows. A hush had settled over the small town, as if everyone had agreed to speak in whispers, or perhaps not at all. It was the kind of night where even time seemed to move differently, gentler, less concerned with being counted. In a quiet house at the end of a tree-lined road, someone sat alone by the window. This was the kind of house that had grown old with dignity. Its wooden floorboards creaked, not out of wear, but because they remembered every step ever taken on them. The furniture bore faint marks of lives lived, scratches on the table from a dropped fork, a dent in the side of the sofa from where someone had leaned too often. The walls were lined with bookshelves and soft lamplight, the kind that didn't shout but whispered its warmth into the corners. The person sitting there, let's call them the listener, because tonight they were not so much a thinker as they were an observer, rested quietly with a blanket across their knees. They weren't waiting for anyone or anything. They were simply watching as the evening melted into night. The air in the room was cool, carrying the faint scent of old wood, of something both comforting and unchanging. Outside, a single street lamp flickered to life. Its light spread in a soft circle, illuminating the damp pavement where the day's earlier rain had left a sheen. Puddles glimmered faintly, reflecting the lamp's glow like tiny, shallow mirrors. A breeze drifted through the trees, their leaves rustling in a language that belonged only to the night. The listener leaned back slightly, eyes half closed. They liked the way night arrived here, not all at once, but in layers. First came the softening of sound, as though the day's noises were fading into a distant memory. Then came the dimming of light, the way colors lost their sharpness and became muted, almost blurred. Finally, the stars appeared, first one, then another, until the sky was scattered with quiet lights. The room itself seemed to respond to the night. The walls, once bathed in golden daylight, now carried the grayish tones of twilight, their shadows stretching in slow patterns. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second passing like the slow drip of water. There was something comforting about its rhythm, something steady in a world that rarely stayed still. The listener reached for the mug on the table beside them. It was filled with warm chamomile tea, its gentle aroma rising with the steam. They took a slow sip, letting the warmth fill their mouth, then swallowed as if to anchor themselves to the present moment. It wasn't about the taste. It was about the act itself, the small, quiet ritual of drinking tea on a night when nothing else demanded their attention. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, low and distant. Then silence returned, as if the night had absorbed the sound and folded it away. The listener's gaze drifted toward the garden, where the faint outlines of flowers could be seen bending in the breeze. During the day, that garden was full of color and life. Bees visiting blossoms, the sharp smell of earth freshly watered. But at night, it became something softer, almost ethereal. The petals seemed to close inward, protecting their secrets from the world. The listener thought about the day that had passed. It had been an ordinary day, perhaps even forgettable in its simplicity, but that was fine. Not every day needed to be marked by something significant. There was a beauty in the uneventful, in the way life often unfolded without drama or noise. They had gone for a short walk earlier, along the quiet road that led to the park. They remembered how the trees had looked, their leaves glowing faintly in the late afternoon sun, how the sound of their own footsteps had echoed softly against the pavement. It had been enough. Sometimes, just noticing the small things, the warmth of the sun on your face, the way a shadow bends across a path, was enough. The tea grew cooler, and the listener set it aside. They adjusted the blanket, tucking it around their legs, and let their mind drift. It wasn't that they were thinking about anything in particular. Thoughts came and went like clouds, but rather that they were aware of how good it felt simply to exist in a moment without needing to move. The night deepened outside. The first crickets began their soft song, their chirping blending into the silence like threads in a tapestry. A single moth fluttered near the lamp, its wings brushing faintly against the glass. The listener watched it for a while, fascinated by how something so small could seem so purposeful, so alive in its quiet persistence. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. Time didn't feel the same here, in this room, on this night. The clock ticked on, but the listener didn't count the seconds. Instead, they watched the shadows shift ever so slightly as the street lamp outside flickered again, its light stretching across the yard. Part 2. The whisper of empty streets. The listener leaned deeper into the chair, their eyes drifting toward the window where the street outside rested under the pale glow of the street lamp. The light pooled on the wet pavement, reflecting like a quiet, shallow pond. Nothing moved there, no cars, no footsteps, just the faint trace of mist winding lazily through the night air. It was the kind of stillness that didn't ask for anything, that simply existed, offering itself to anyone who cared enough to notice. The listener took another slow breath. The air carried the faintest trace of rain, though the rain itself had stopped hours ago. That lingering scent of water on stone, of damp earth, always seemed to settle the mind. It reminded them of mornings when the world felt clean, as though everything had been washed free of its weight overnight. They let their gaze wander. The bookshelves along the wall were lined with volumes they had collected over many years. Some had been read countless times, the spines bent and worn. Others had been opened only once, yet they remained on the shelf like quiet sentinels, waiting for the right evening to call someone back to their pages. The listener didn't reach for any book tonight. They didn't need words or stories. They simply wanted this quiet, this slow rhythm of time passing. The clock chimed softly, its sound filling the room but not disturbing it. Each note hung in the air for a second, then faded like ripples in water. It was an old clock, the kind that needed to be wound by hand. The listener liked that. There was something comforting about rituals that required patience, about things that weren't designed to rush. They shifted in their chair, feeling the fabric of the blanket brush against their legs. It was a soft wool blanket, one they had owned for years. It carried with it a faint smell of laundry soap and something else, something harder to name, a scent of time itself, perhaps, or simply of home. They pulled it higher across their lap, leaning back as their shoulders eased into the cushion behind them. Outside, a single breeze stirred, moving the branches of the nearest tree. The sound was faint but clear, a soft rustling that seemed almost like a whisper. The listener watched as the shadow of the tree danced on the wet pavement, shifting slowly, as if the night itself were breathing. Their mind wandered. It drifted to memories of other quiet nights, long ago. Nights when they had sat by a window in another house, perhaps as a child, watching as the stars appeared one by one. They remembered the feeling of safety in those moments, the sense that the night was both vast and kind. Even now, decades later, that feeling returned whenever they allowed themselves to be still. The tea had grown cool, so they reached for the kettle to pour another cup. The sound of water hitting the ceramic cup was gentle, like rain tapping softly on a roof. They added a spoonful of honey, stirring it slowly, watching the way the golden liquid dissolved and disappeared into the pale tea. The aroma rose again, warm and floral, filling the small room with its soothing scent. They sipped slowly, the warmth spreading through their chest, grounding them in the present moment. They thought about how rare it was, in the busyness of life, to simply sit and taste something, to feel the texture of a moment. Most days were a blur of motion, places to be, things to do, but nights like this reminded them that stillness was not emptiness. It was fullness of another kind. The crickets outside had grown louder now, their soft chorus filling the quiet spaces between thoughts. Somewhere farther off, perhaps down the road, a distant train rumbled softly. Its sound was muffled by the mist, but it carried a strange comfort. The listener closed their eyes for a moment, imagining the train cutting through dark fields and sleeping towns, carrying its small world of passengers under the same stars that glowed above this house. When they opened their eyes again, the moon had shifted higher. It hung low but bright, a thin crescent that cast silver light across the yard. The grass shimmered faintly where the dew had begun to form, tiny beads of water catching the glow like scattered jewels. The listener reached for their notebook. It was a simple book with a leather cover, its pages filled with half-written thoughts, quotes, and small sketches. They opened it to a blank page, holding the pen loosely in their hand. For a moment, they wrote nothing. Then, slowly, words began to form, small observations about the night, about the way the air felt against the skin, about how silence itself could feel like music if you listened closely enough. The pen scratched softly against the paper, the only sound in the room besides the clock and the wind. They didn't write for anyone else. These notes were not for sharing. They were simply a way of tracing the shape of the moment, of catching something that might otherwise slip by unnoticed. When the page was filled, they closed the notebook and set it aside. The room felt even quieter now, as if the night had paused to watch them. They leaned back again, their head resting against the chair, and let their thoughts drift once more. Part 3. The slow breath of night. The night deepened, settling into its quiet rhythm like a long, gentle sigh. The listener remained in their chair, the cup of tea now empty on the table beside them. They didn't move to refill it. Instead, they simply sat, feeling the warmth that lingered in their hands from holding the cup. The warmth was fading, but in its place, a soft calmness was growing, like the calmness of an empty street after a storm. The air outside had grown cooler. A faint fog began to form, creeping low to the ground, wrapping the street and the garden in a soft veil. The light from the street lamp shone through the mist, scattering into a pale halo. The listener stared at it for a long time, finding something strangely beautiful in how the world looked half-hidden, as if every ordinary object had taken on a quiet mystery. From somewhere down the road, the sound of water dripping reached their ears. It was probably from the gutter of a house or a rain-soaked tree branch, but the rhythm of it, soft, steady, was soothing. Each drop sounded like it was counting time, though time here felt like it had slowed to something less measurable, something closer to a heartbeat. The house itself had begun to settle for the night. Old wooden beams made their soft, familiar sounds, tiny pops and sighs, the language of a structure that had weathered many seasons. These sounds didn't disturb the listener. They were part of the house's character, part of its nightly conversation with the wind and the cooling air. They shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket draped over their knees. The fabric, warmed by their body, felt like a second skin. The weight of it grounded them, anchoring them in this simple moment. There was nothing waiting to be done tonight. No tasks, no lists, only the long, slow passage of time and the small, beautiful details of a world winding down. Their thoughts wandered to the past, not in a nostalgic or heavy way, but like someone walking through an old garden, brushing their fingers over the leaves. They thought of summer nights from years ago, when they had stayed out under the stars with friends, talking quietly until the sky began to lighten. They remembered the laughter, the smell of grass crushed under blankets, the distant sound of a river flowing somewhere in the dark. Those nights had felt endless, as if the world existed only for them. The listener smiled faintly at the memory. There was something about night that made the world softer, kinder. Daytime was often filled with sharp edges, noise, urgency, the weight of things left undone. But at night, everything seemed to pause. Even memories felt gentler, like they were wrapped in the same mist that now blanketed the street outside. They rose from the chair, stretching their arms overhead, and walked slowly to the bookshelf. The floor beneath their feet felt cool and smooth. The shelves were filled with books of all kinds, novels, journals, old cookbooks with notes scribbled in the margins. Their fingers trailed across the spines, feeling the different textures, some smooth, some rough, some with small tears. They pulled out a thin book of poetry, its pages yellowed with age, and carried it back to the chair. Sitting again, they opened the book at random and began to read. The words were soft and simple, but they felt alive, as though the poet had written them for this very night. They read slowly, not to reach the end of the page, but to savor each line. Sometimes they would pause between stanzas, letting the silence around them mingle with the rhythm of the poem. The sound of the clock ticked on, its steady beat filling the room like a quiet metronome. The listener found themselves reading less and simply gazing at the page, their mind drifting somewhere between the poem and the night outside. Eventually, they closed the book and set it aside. There was no need for more words. The room itself felt like it was speaking in its own quiet language. The moonlight shifted again, slipping through the window and falling across the rug in a silver stripe. The listener watched the pattern of light and shadow, noticing how it made the fibers of the rug shimmer like threads of silk. It was such a small detail, something most people would never notice. But tonight, it felt like a gift, a moment of still beauty. They leaned their head back and closed their eyes. The night was quiet, but not empty. It was full of small sounds, the wind brushing the trees, the distant hum of the earth, the faint whisper of their own breathing. It was in these sounds, these soft and nearly invisible things, that they felt most at peace. Part 4. The hours that drift. The listener remained with eyes half closed, feeling the slow rhythm of the night settle deeper into the house. The clock ticked steadily, each sound carrying like a small drop of water falling into a still pond. There was something comforting in its persistence. It asked nothing of them, offered no urgency, just the quiet reminder that time was moving, but not rushing. The air had cooled further, and the blanket now felt even more comforting. It was a soft weight across their knees, a reminder of warmth in the middle of a cool and misty night. Outside the window, the fog had thickened slightly, blurring the edges of the world. The street beyond looked like a dreamscape. Muted colors, soft lines, and that familiar orange glow of the street lamp diffused into a pale, hazy circle. They took a slow breath, holding it for a moment before letting it go. Each exhale seemed to carry away the weight of the day, whatever small worries might have lingered. They thought briefly of the hours they had spent earlier, simple errands, a walk through the quiet park, a meal eaten slowly at the kitchen table. None of it had been remarkable, but the lack of hurry felt like a kind of freedom. The listener's gaze drifted again to the bookshelves. They wondered how many hours of their life had been spent here, surrounded by paper and stories. Sometimes they read for hours without realizing it, getting lost in the rhythm of sentences. Other times, they simply looked at the shelves, letting their fingers trail over the books, not to open them, but to remember that they were there. A collection of voices waiting patiently in the silence. The wind outside shifted, brushing softly against the window panes. It wasn't strong, just enough to make the branches sway and tap lightly against the side of the house. The sound reminded them of rainy nights when they were young, those moments when they would lie in bed, listening to the storm outside, feeling safe and warm under the covers. They reached for their cup, though it was empty now, and set it aside. The idea of making more tea crossed their mind, but it didn't seem necessary. The taste and warmth of the last cup still lingered in memory, and tonight was less about what they did and more about simply being present. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed in this quiet way. Time had a strange quality at night, especially nights like this. It didn't feel like something linear. It felt more like a gentle current, carrying them along without hurry, without direction. They stood slowly and walked to the window. The glass was cool under their fingertips as they leaned slightly forward, looking out at the garden. The flowers were barely visible now, their shapes blurred by the mist. A few drops of moisture clung to the window, left behind by the earlier rain. They traced one with their finger, watching as it left a faint trail of condensation. The yard beyond the window felt like its own small world. The trees stood like quiet guardians, their branches stretching toward the sky. The grass shimmered faintly, touched by dew that caught the light of the street lamp. Even the shadows seemed alive, shifting with the breeze. It was all ordinary, yet something about it felt profound, as though the night itself was sharing a secret. They returned to the chair and pulled the blanket tighter. It was as if the house had grown quieter still, as if even the walls and floors were settling into sleep. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound besides the clock. That hum was familiar, constant. Another rhythm in the symphony of this still night. Their mind drifted again to memories, quiet summer evenings spent with a journal, winter nights wrapped in heavy quilts with a book in hand. These were moments that had never seemed remarkable at the time, but now they felt like treasures. Life, they thought, was not built from grand moments alone. It was built from nights like this, from the way the light hit the floor or the way tea steam curled in the air. The listeners' breathing slowed. They let their eyes wander to the ceiling, watching the play of shadows as the lamp flickered softly. A moth moved past the light, casting a small, delicate silhouette. For a moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the space of that light, that shadow, that quiet hum. Part 5. When the night pauses, the night had reached that quiet hour when everything feels suspended, as though the world has stopped turning just for a moment. The listener shifted slightly in their chair, feeling the soft give of the cushion beneath them, the weight of the blanket around their legs. The house was silent, but it was not an empty silence. It was filled with small, almost imperceptible sounds: the creak of the floorboards settling, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Each sound was like a thread woven into the stillness of the room. Outside, the fog had thickened. It curled and stretched around the trees and the street lamp, turning the familiar shapes of the yard into muted silhouettes. The road beyond the house seemed to vanish into a soft, gray haze, as though it led to nowhere at all. The world felt smaller, wrapped in a cocoon of mist and moonlight. The listener's gaze wandered to the window, where a single drop of condensation had gathered at the corner. It slid slowly down the glass, leaving a faint trail behind it, until it disappeared into the window frame. They watched it, fascinated by the smallness of it, by how even something as simple as a drop of water could hold its own kind of beauty. They reached for their notebook again, flipping through the pages filled with notes and sketches. Some pages were filled with words, lines of quiet reflection, fragments of poems. Others held small, simple drawings: the curve of a leaf, the shape of a candle flame, the way light fell through the window at certain times of day. They stopped on a page where they had once written a single sentence: "The night is not silent, but full of quiet conversations we rarely hear." The listener traced the words with their fingertip, thinking about how true that felt now that a faint sound outside caught their attention. Perhaps the call of an owl, low and distant. It echoed softly through the night, breaking the stillness without disturbing it. The listener closed their eyes, imagining the bird perched somewhere in the dark, its wings folded, its eyes watching the world with quiet patience. They sipped the last of their tea, though it was lukewarm now, and set the cup aside. The taste lingered, soft and floral, like a memory that didn't quite fade. They thought about making another cup, but instead, they stayed still. There was no rush. Everything about this night invited slowness. The clock ticked on. The sound seemed louder now, as though the house had grown even quieter. Each tick was like a breath, steady and unchanging. The listener found themselves matching their own breathing to its rhythm. Inhale, tick. Exhale, tick. The simple act of breathing, of listening to that tiny sound, became its own form of meditation. After some time, they rose from the chair and walked slowly through the house. Their footsteps were soft on the wooden floor. In the hallway, the light was dim, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. They paused near the door to the kitchen, glancing at the shelves lined with glass jars and bowls. Everything was in its place, neat and familiar. It was strange, they thought, how comforting familiarity could be. Even the shape of the shadows on the wall felt like an old friend. They returned to the living room and sat again, pulling the blanket around their shoulders this time. The air had grown cooler, and the warmth of the blanket was welcome. Outside, the fog shifted slightly as a breeze moved through the trees, causing the branches to sway. The sound was soft, like a whisper just beyond hearing. The listener's mind wandered to old memories, nights spent camping beneath open skies, when the stars seemed so close it felt as though you could reach up and touch them. They remembered lying on their back, staring up until their eyes blurred, feeling both small and infinite at the same time. Those nights had carried the same kind of stillness as this one, the same sense of being connected to something larger and quieter than themselves. That a moth brushed against the lamp again, its small wings making the faintest sound as they struck the glass. The listener watched it for a moment, following its erratic flight before it disappeared into the shadows of the room. There was something comforting about that small life moving through the night, a reminder that even in stillness, there is always movement, always something alive. Part 6. The gentle shape of time. The night had grown deeper now. Hours might have passed since the listener first settled into their chair, but it was hard to tell. Time, in this quiet house, had loosened its grip. It no longer marched forward in measured steps. It simply drifted, as softly and imperceptibly as mist over the ground. The listener stirred slightly, shifting the blanket so that it rested snugly over their shoulders. The warmth of it contrasted with the cool air that occasionally seeped through the cracks of the old window frames. There was a faint hum outside, the sound of distant traffic, far enough away that it blended into the quiet like a low, endless sigh. It was not intrusive. In fact, it reminded them that beyond this little cocoon of stillness, life continued in its own way. Their gaze settled on the bookshelf again, but not to choose a book. Tonight, the books felt like quiet companions, their spines lined up like rows of sleeping faces. Each title carried a world inside it, but the listener did not need another world tonight. This one, this room, this quiet, this slow unraveling of thoughts was enough. The moon had moved higher, spilling pale light through the window. It painted the rug with a silver rectangle and touched the wooden floor with a faint sheen. The listener leaned back and let their eyes follow the shifting patterns of light and shadow. It was fascinating how the simplest things, the way moonlight touched wood, the way the curtain swayed ever so slightly in the breeze, could feel alive if you really paid attention. They closed their eyes for a while, not to sleep, but to listen. The house had its own subtle language. Somewhere, a beam creaked as it adjusted to the cooling night air. The wind traced its fingers across the leaves outside, creating a faint, rustling song. And beneath it all, there was the quiet sound of their own breathing, steady and calm, like a reminder that they were here, that this moment was theirs. The listener's mind wandered back to the day just past. It had been an ordinary day, the kind that often slips through memory unnoticed. They had walked along the small road behind the house, where the trees formed a canopy overhead. They remembered the smell of rain lingering on the leaves, the way puddles reflected the gray clouds. There had been a bench near the end of the path, and they had sat there for a while, watching a pair of sparrows pecking at the ground. Those simple moments had felt like small gifts. They thought about how often life is made of such moments, quiet, unremarkable things that, when strung together, form something beautiful. A warm cup of tea, a soft blanket, a walk beneath the trees. Nights like this, all of it was enough. The listener shifted again, adjusting the cushion beneath them. The room seemed to breathe with them, its shadows moving as if alive. A thin wisp of fog pressed against the outside of the window, softening the light. Somewhere beyond the house, a single dog barked once, then all was still again. Reaching for the notebook, They flipped to a blank page and began to write. The words came slowly, like drops of water forming on the edge of a leaf. They wrote about the night, the feel of the air, the soft glow of the street lamp, the way the silence seemed to carry meaning without needing to be explained. The pen scratched gently on the paper, a sound that blended with the ticking of the clock. After filling the page, they set the notebook aside and picked up a small candle from the table. It was unlit, but they traced its shape with their fingers, feeling the smoothness of the wax, the slight curve where the wick emerged. Lighting it seemed unnecessary tonight. The moonlight was enough. They leaned back once more and let their eyes wander around the room. The walls, painted a soft cream color, seemed to absorb the glow of the lamp and the moon. The corners of the room were filled with shadows, but they were soft shadows, gentle and undemanding that as they sat. A memory came to them, unbidden but welcome. It was of a night many years ago, in another quiet house, when they had stayed up late to watch the stars. They had been younger then, sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around their shoulders, feeling the cool air on their skin. The memory was clear, as if the years between then and now had fallen away. They could almost feel that same air now, hear the same soft chorus of crickets. The listener smiled faintly. It was comforting, how the night could connect different moments of life, stitching them together with its quiet thread. Part 7. The long drift of midnight. The listener sat perfectly still, feeling the slow breath of midnight move through the house. The quiet had deepened, like a pool of water that had grown still after hours of rippling. Even the faintest sounds seemed to stretch and echo, each tick of the clock, each sigh of the wind outside the window. The house was not empty, but alive in its silence, as if every wall and every piece of furniture was holding its breath along with the night. The blanket across their shoulders had grown warmer, carrying the faint scent of soap and thyme. They let their hand rest lightly on its edge, feeling the soft texture between their fingers. Their gaze wandered slowly around the room. It was a room they knew well, yet on nights like this, it felt almost new. The glow of the lamp softened the edges of everything. The old table, the framed pictures on the wall, the books stacked neatly on the shelves. Each object seemed to hum with quiet presence. The listener reached for the notebook again, though they didn't write. They opened to a page from weeks ago, where they had scribbled a line in the early hours of another night. There is a kind of silence that feels like the world is holding you, rather than ignoring you. They read the line once, then again, and felt that it captured this moment perfectly. The night wasn't empty. It was embracing them in its own way. They thought about how often life was made up of noise and motion, conversations, schedules, tasks that filled the hours. But here, in this small room with nothing but the slow turn of time, they felt none of that. There was no rush to fill the space, no need for more than what already was. It was enough to exist, to breathe, to listen. The tea on the table had gone cold, so they stood to make another cup. Their steps were soft on the wooden floor, the boards creaking gently beneath their weight. In the kitchen, they filled the kettle, listening to the hollow sound of water hitting metal. The act of making tea was simple, but tonight it felt like a small ritual, a way to honor the quiet, to give shape to the hours. While the water heated, they leaned against the counter, feeling its cool surface under their hands. The room was dim, lit only by a small bulb near the stove. The shadows stretched long across the walls, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was like a low lullaby. They watched the steam begin to curl from the kettle, the first wisps rising and twisting before vanishing into the air. When the water was ready, they poured it slowly into the cup, watching as the tea leaves swirled like tiny dancers in the heat. The steam rose, soft and fragrant, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. They held the cup between their hands for a moment, feeling the warmth spread into their palms, before walking back to the living room. The chair welcomed them, its familiar cushions sinking just enough under their weight. They pulled the blanket tighter around themselves and lifted the cup to their lips, taking a slow sip. The tea was warm and sweet, and it seemed to spread its calmness through their chest, into their arms, and out through their fingertips. Outside, the mist had thickened again, wrapping the garden in a gauzy veil. The street lamp shone through it like a distant beacon, its light softened to a pale glow. The listener stared at it for a long time, watching the way the mist moved, curling, folding, dissolving, as if it had a life of its own. They remembered, suddenly, a night many years ago when they had been caught in a heavy fog while walking home. They had been much younger then, but they could still recall the way the world had seemed to disappear, how each step felt like walking through a dream. That night had been quiet like this one, except for the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the trees. For some reason, the memory felt warm, like a candle glowing in the dark. The listener set down the cup and leaned back, letting their head rest against the chair. They closed their eyes and listened again. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps down the road or in the trees beyond the yard, an owl called out, a low, echoing sound that seemed to stretch across the fog. The sound faded, and the silence returned, but it was a silence enriched by the memory of that call. Minutes, or perhaps hours, slipped by. It was impossible to tell. The listener didn't mind. Time felt softer here, less like something to measure and more like something to feel. The steady tick of the clock, the slow cooling of the tea, the faint brush of the wind outside, all of it marked time, but gently, as if the night itself understood the value of unhurried moments. Part 8. The endless night's quiet path. The listener shifted slightly in the chair, feeling the creak of the wooden frame beneath them. It was a familiar sound, one that had been part of countless nights spent here, in this same room, surrounded by the same familiar objects. Everything in the house seemed to hold a story, stories not of loud events or dramatic changes, but of simple, unspoken moments that had accumulated over years. The chair, the rug, the shelves of books, even the clock ticking softly on the wall, each had absorbed something of the life lived around them. The clock, especially, seemed to carry a quiet authority tonight. Its rhythmic ticking filled the silence, not in a way that intruded, but in a way that reminded the listener that time was flowing, even now. Not rushing, not demanding, but moving forward like the steady breath of the earth. Each tick was a soft echo of the countless ticks that had come before, a reminder that the present moment was just another link in an endless chain. The listener's gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the mist had thickened further, transforming the garden into a shifting, silvered dreamscape. The trees stood like tall shadows, their branches moving only slightly in the breeze. The light from the street lamp pooled softly on the wet pavement, reflecting faintly in the puddles left by the earlier rain. Every so often, a breeze would ripple through, scattering the reflection, and then the stillness would return. They reached for their cup of tea, now lukewarm, and took a slow sip. The taste was muted but familiar, soft chamomile with a hint of honey. The cup felt smooth and cool in their hands, its ceramic surface carrying the lingering warmth of the tea it had held. Setting it down gently on the table, they adjusted the blanket draped across their knees, pulling it closer to their chest. The fabric was comforting, heavy enough to feel like an embrace. The house itself seemed to respond to the deepening night. The sounds of the day had long since vanished. No distant hum of traffic, no voices from neighboring houses. Only the soft sounds of wood expanding and contracting as it cooled, the faint whisper of the breeze outside, and the ever-present tick of the clock. These sounds were small, but they gave the night a texture, a kind of living quality that made it feel like the house was breathing alongside them. The listener's eyes roamed the room, resting on the bookshelf once again. They considered pulling down a book, perhaps reading a few pages of poetry, but something in the quiet atmosphere of the night felt too precious to interrupt with words. Instead, they simply stared at the spines of the books, tracing the faded letters of familiar titles. Each book held a world, but tonight, the listener felt that they were already inside a story made up of silence, of moonlight, of the simple act of being here. That a small sound drew their attention. It was the rustle of leaves outside, a brief shiver of movement caused by the breeze. They imagined the branches swaying gently, the leaves brushing against each other, whispering in a language too soft to understand. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the stillness even deeper in its absence. The moonlight spilled through the window, painting pale shapes on the rug. The listener watched as the light shifted slightly, inching across the floor. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but they could see how the angle of the shadows had changed from earlier. Time was passing, but in a way that felt gentle, unhurried. There was no need to rush, no need to measure the hours too closely. Part 9. When shadows rest, the listener sat in the chair for a long time, watching the slow dance of candlelight flicker across the walls. The shadows seemed alive, stretching and folding with every tiny shift in the flame. Outside, the fog lay thick against the window, and the glow of the street lamp looked softer now, almost like the pale shimmer of a dream. The house was wrapped in such a quiet stillness that even the smallest sound became noticeable. The tick of the clock was steady and calm, each tick marking not just time but presence, as if reminding the listener to simply exist in this very moment. The occasional soft creak of the wooden floor or the sigh of the wind brushing the side of the house was not a disturbance, but a gentle part of the night's own breathing. The listener lifted the blanket from their lap and stood. Their feet touched the wooden floor softly as they moved toward the kitchen, carrying the empty teacup. The faint smell of honey lingered on the cup, a memory of warmth. In the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, blending into the stillness like a distant hum of life. They refilled the kettle, the water splashing quietly as it struck the metal, and set it on the stove. While waiting for it to heat, they leaned against the countertop, resting their palms on the cool surface. They stared out the small kitchen window, but there was little to see. Only the fog pressing like a gray curtain, with the faint hint of tree branches beyond. The world outside had folded in on itself, leaving only this quiet space, this kitchen, this warm, waiting moment. The kettle whistled softly, pulling the listener back. They turned off the heat, poured water into the cup, and added the tea bag with slow, deliberate movements. The rising steam curled into the air, carrying the soft, calming scent of chamomile. They watched it swirl for a moment before taking the cup and returning to the living room. The candles still burned steadily on the table. They placed the cup beside it and sat back down, sinking once more into the deep comfort of the chair. The blanket, still warm, was pulled close again. They wrapped both hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep into their skin, grounding them in the present. The first sip was a quiet warmth spreading through their chest. They took another, slower this time, and then simply held the cup as they gazed at the candlelight. Outside, an owl called from somewhere unseen, its low voice rolling through the fog like an ancient note. It called once, then again, and then the night swallowed the sound, leaving the silence even more profound. The listener thought of nothing and everything all at once. Thoughts rose like bubbles, small and unimportant. Memories of childhood summers, of mornings when the world was fresh and full of sunlight, of winters when the snow muffled every sound, leaving only the crunch of footsteps and the warmth of home waiting inside. These thoughts drifted away as easily as they came, replaced by the simple act of breathing. The candle's flame wavered slightly, bending as though responding to a breath from nowhere. The listener stared at it, watching the way the wax softened and pooled, the slow crawl of a single droplet making its way down the side of the candle. It was mesmerizing how something so small and ordinary could hold so much quiet beauty. They glanced at the clock. It was late, very late, but the night did not seem to mind. There was no urgency here, no reason to mark the hours. The night was a place that stretched, that opened, that allowed the mind to rest. Part 10. The quiet before dawn. The listener sat with the candle still burning low, its flame now smaller, the wax pooling around the base. Hours had passed, though they had not noticed the steady flow of time. The night had grown deeper, softer, quieter, as though the whole world was gently folding inward, preparing for rest. They held the last sip of tea in their cup, lukewarm, but still carrying the scent of honey and chamomile. The cup had grown cool against their hands, but they didn't mind. It felt like holding a memory, something simple and comforting that didn't need to last forever. Outside, the mist remained, but now there were faint hints of change, a lighter tone to the horizon, a whisper of something new beyond the fog. The listener stared through the glass, tracing the shapes of the garden and the quiet road beyond. The shadows that had once seemed so deep now felt softer, as if the approaching dawn was brushing them aside with invisible hands. They stood slowly, leaving the chair for the first time in what felt like hours. The blanket slipped from their shoulders and fell in a soft heap. The wooden floor creaked faintly under their weight as they walked to the window. Placing their hand on the cool glass, they leaned forward slightly, taking in the last deep breath of night. The silence was complete, yet not empty. It was filled with all the small sounds that made the night alive. The quiet hum of the house, the faint rustle of trees, the occasional distant bark of a dog, or the soft call of a bird stirring early. It was as though the night was speaking its final words, saying goodbye before it slipped away. The listener turned and looked around the room. The candle on the table flickered, its flame thinning as it melted deeper into the wax. The books stood neatly on the shelves. The chair stood where it had always been, and the clock on the wall ticked its unchanging rhythm. Everything felt still, but not lifeless. Rather, it felt as though the house itself was preparing to close its eyes, to rest along with the night. They walked back to the chair, gently blowing out the candle. The flame flared, then vanished, leaving behind a thin trail of smoke that curled and danced upward, catching the pale moonlight before fading. The room darkened, but the listener felt no fear, only calm. They sat again, this time not to stay awake, but to feel the last minutes of the night flow through them like water. The fog outside began to thin, breaking apart in patches that revealed the soft outlines of the street. A faint bluish light touched the sky, the very first breath of dawn. The listener watched it grow, feeling something like gratitude, though no words were spoken. The night had been long, slow, and kind, and now it was leaving gently, without hurry. They closed their eyes for a moment, listening to the final quiet. The ticking of the clock grew softer in their mind, blending with their breath. A long exhale left their chest, carrying with it every thought, every tension. When they opened their eyes again, the world outside was shifting, the mist now glowing faintly in the growing light. The listener stood, folded the blanket neatly on the chair, and placed the empty cup on the table. They did not need another sip, for the warmth of the tea remained in them like a memory of the night. The door to their room stood open, waiting. They walked slowly through the house, each step quiet and unhurried. The walls seemed to whisper a soft farewell, the shadows pulling back as the light crept in. Before stepping into their room, they turned once more toward the window, toward the fading night, and whispered a thank you, not with words, but with the simple, grateful silence of their heart. The night was over, but its calmness would linger, like the final notes of a song that stay in the mind long after the music stops. And with that, they lay down, the weight of sleep coming not as an intrusion but as a gift. The last thing they saw, just before their eyes closed, was the pale light of dawn touching the curtains, promising a gentle day ahead. The end.